big thing that people are not necessarily talking about as much is actually toxin overload, including heavy metals. And with heavy metals, this is something that I think when that word comes up or the conversation comes up, people are like, why would I have heavy metals?
Right.
When I say heavy metals, I mean things like aluminum, mercury, barium, cadmium, arsenic. What I find so interesting nowadays is mercury is actually passed generation to generation. And reason being is so many of us, especially, like parents above the age of 30, they've all had some level of amalgam fillings in their teeth, which are the silver fillings that are mercury based. And if those are in the mouth, giving off those gases that get into the system, will be passing a portion of that to your child. And I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty by any means as a parent.
This is fascinating. I never thought about it and made that connection. I mean, I've heard about the mercury in fillings, but I never made the connection from generation to generation.
Well, what got me really thinking outside the box was I was testing young kids, and I do a hair analysis to test for heavy metals. So it's very easy to do for kids especially. But I was seeing these little kids who, 1 year old, 2 years old, 3 years old, and they had massive heavy metals. And I'm like, how does this happen? Like, how are they this young and have heavy metals in their system?
Right.
So it got me really thinking. And one of my mentors, who has been in practice for over 40 years, he said that the firstborn, which is me, gets 80% of mom's mercury.
Interesting. Okay.
So where's your hand? I find that very, very interesting because with the mercury, there is definitely a problem with fish. The mercury that is in the oceans that are being consumed, especially by these larger fish, is problematic in itself. But then there is the big culprit of the amalgam fillings. And then there is a level of vaccinations. And I know that's a controversial topic, but one thing to understand is there is some level of mercury that are in vaccines. So there is some level of exposure to adults, young kids from that as well. So this accumulation in the body, again, mercury is one of those things that it's not leaving unless you provoke it. So you really have to actually do some level of detoxification to help to bind it in the body and get it out of the system. So this is one of the reasons why it is passed from generation to generation, because most people are not necessarily being educated on detoxification, let alone seeking it out, unless they have, some really, really major issues that nobody knows what's wrong with them. So with all of this happening, what they're finding is that these are major, major stressors to the brain. One of the things, again, might not be well known is that the brain runs off sugar. It runs off glucose.
Yeah.
So if the brain is running off glucose, and you start to have an accumulation of different things that are neurotoxic or stressing the brain needs more glucose. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of our kids are craving sugar.
Fascinating. What's interesting, because I talk a lot about the kids craving sugar. I mean, obviously part of it is taste buds change and can, shift over time. And I talk a lot about the nervous system, right? And talk about these two different sides, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And especially how when you're in sympathetic, it's a high glucose burning machine. Your brain is like constantly burning sugar. So your kids, if they're in stress response mode, they're going to crave more and more sugar. This adds a whole nother element to it. Like if there's these metals, as you're saying, or this toxic buildup, that's going to put their brain in that, what I like to call light switch flipped on stress response mode even more and drive the sugar cravings. Is that kind of how it's all related?
So the analogy that I heard, and this made a lot of sense to me. So think about the Grand Canyon.
Okay.
So you have the Grand Canyon, and there are rivers that flow through it in a very specific way. There's going to be wind that flows through it in a very specific way. So everything kind of flows in a very specific pattern. So if you started to dump a bunch of boulders in the middle of the Grand Canyon, things have to reroute itself. And essentially, the water has to figure out a new way to flow. The air has to figure out a new way to flow. So this essentially takes more energy for everything rerouting. So if you think about it in reference to the brain, so you have two sides of the brain, they do two different things, but they do communicate with each other. They have to. So one of the things that they find is that these heavy metals, they pool in a cavern in between the two hemispheres of the brain, because that cavern before the age of 18 is not closed. So for whatever reason, heavy metals have an affinity to get into this cavern. So now the brain is trying to communicate with each other, but it's actually, first of all, it has to work a lot harder. It actually has to create new pathways.
Oh, interesting. I like that analogy.
What I have found to be the most successful is a combination of things, but it's really helping someone to eliminate these different types of heavy metals through their gastrointestinal system. So actually through their stool. And because of this, you obviously have to make sure that there's some level of like binders in the mix, so making sure that nothing is getting out of the gut. But the gut is the safest way to actually excrete these heavy metals, because at that point, the liver and the gut, they work together. So you support the liver, you support the gut, you make sure that you're using binders so that nothing is getting into the bloodstream, and everything moves out of the body very smoothly through the stool. So this is also something important. If somebody is saying, oh, my kid is very constipated, then you might, right off the bat that your child is having trouble with elimination. So they're having trouble eliminating not just their stool, but toxins. So that's something to consider as well, is you want to make sure that system is working optimally, and that is one of the safest ways to get the heavy metals out.
Just to kind of jump in here, I will say that in many cases, many of my clients and many people that I talk to, they do mention, usually in some way, shape, or form, it comes that, well, my child does have constipation, or they did for a while, or they do kind of off and on. Like that definitely, I think, is something that seems to go hand in hand with sometimes the behaviors that we see of distraction or hypersensitivity, or even distended bowels and abdomen and things like that. Right. So do you have any recommendations or suggestions for how to support our children's, really their gut detoxification and having all the systems a go?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say from a dietary perspective, there's a couple things to consider, which are not always the easiest with kids. But one thing to know is that one of the biggest supporters of liver detoxification pathways is the cruciferous vegetable category. So the cruciferous vegetables are sometimes easy to kind of throw into soups and stews and things like that, but it's a combination of broccoli, kale, cauliflower, bok choy, Swiss chard, spinach, arugula. There's a lot more on that list as well. And these are things you might be like, my kid is never going to eat that. But, definitely you can always check out our website, because we do post a lot of recipes that are kid friendly. And I know that you guys have your cookbook as well. So being able to kind of just hide them in certain, again, soups and stews and things like that, it really helps. Or even throw it into a smoothie and they don't even know it's there.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I honestly feel like that's the best way to start the process, is to really blend it up or puree it or make it really small. A lot of times it's the texture, I think, that kids really get turned off by, and when it can kind of just disappear, it's not usually as revolted.